itself back in 1950, again, according to UN definitions, Egypt was 30% urban. Today, it is classified as 42% urban, though I think a little bit higher. The projection for mid-century 2050 is 56% urban, but I'll bet you it will be well over 60% by the time we get to 2050. For the world as a whole, it's no different. We reached, for the first time in human history, half urban for the global society around 2007. From time immemorial up until the 1800s, more than 90% of the world lived in rural areas, and the vast majority of the population was engaged in agriculture. Now we are 55% urban worldwide. According to the UN projections, we'll reach 68% worldwide urbanization by mid-century, but again, I'll bet you will be well over 70%. The most fundamental factor that drives urbanization is actually the technological changes in agriculture. When it takes one family to feed one family, everybody lives in rural areas. When it takes one family farm to feed 10 people, then roughly 90% will be in urban areas because the manufacturing and the service economy especially are intrinsically urban, face-to-face, more productive and densely settled urban aggregations. And so as agriculture has modernized, so too has the rate of urbanization soared. And what's happening in agriculture now with the digital revolution, with artificial intelligence, with precision agriculture, is that more and more agriculture is being mechanized. It's farmed by robots, by remote sensors, by precision fertilization, and so on. I spoke to one farmer in Canada a few years ago who told me that he doesn't really farm anymore. He's got thousands of hectares on a giant farm in Canada. He says he sits on a tractor. The tractor does all the work because it knows by satellite reading precisely where to deposit the fertilizers, and basically the farm is completely mechanized. And this is the way of almost all of the goods producing economy, agriculture. So in general, urban society. But the urban regions are also enormously stressed, and that is the challenge of smart cities in the future. All of our cities, and I think Cairo is certainly no exception, have been overwhelmed by population growth over the last half century. Infrastructure is often outdated, is heavily depreciated. In many American cities, water is not safe because the pipes are corroded and there's lead in the water supply or other toxics in the water supply. American cities were built for automobiles. That was understandable in the 20th century, but it turned into a kind of disaster because we spend so much of our lives commuting to and from workplaces, or more fundamentally stuck in congestion. But of course, all of the infrastructure challenges are becoming seriously
stressed by the ongoing environmental crises that cities are facing in all parts of the world. Climate change is accelerating. We have been warming worldwide at a rate of about 0.2 degrees Celsius every decade, but now we are warming at roughly twice that rate. Last time I checked, Cairo was a pretty hot place. Last time I had the pleasure to visit, and I look forward to being in Cairo again this June. Cairo is already hot and getting hotter fast. And of course, the cities not only are experiencing rising temperatures, but they are, of course, themselves heat islands. So they are heat multipliers because of the hot surfaces, because of the changes of reflectance in cities. We have temperatures that are often several degrees Celsius warmer than the ambient temperatures. And in many cities, and I think Cairo is certainly one of them, heat waves exacerbated by the heat island effect could lead to massive deaths, actually, especially if there are breakdowns in power or water supply. And we know that it's not only the warming and the urban heat island effects that are afflicting cities, but cities are absolutely threatened and challenged by changes in the hydrologic cycle in different ways, in different places. In Egypt, which is already largely a hyper-arid region, aside from the Nile Valley and the Nile the studies show will decline by 10 or 20% in the coming decades. Very threatening. The upstream dams on the Nile pose further serious threats to Egypt, though these are heatedly debated subjects. I would say the water supply for Egypt's cities is therefore obviously crucial issue in the future and one that will become more serious in the future. Other cities are facing chronic flooding, as we saw in Pakistan this year, because the higher temperatures mean more intensity of the monsoon cycle, and the deforestation in the Himalayan highlands means more sediment and more less capture of water in the highlands by forests, rather, flooding coming down to the lowlands. And Pakistan had at least a third of the country underwater and the major cities severely flooded. So droughts, floods, heat waves, and let me add one more problem that will be very serious for a significant part of the world's urban societies, including the small island that I live on. I live on an island called Manhattan, one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, and we may be in for a multi-meter rise of sea level in the second half of the 21st century because of the accelerating degradation and disintegration of the ice sheets in Antarctica. And if there's a major breakoff of a part of the West Antarctica ice shelf, this could lead to a massive worldwide sea level rise of several meters. And a large part of our urban world has been built at the coasts because because at the coast, and the estuaries, and the great rivers, this is where trade takes place. This is where the ports are located. And we designed the world to accommodate international trade, not to accommodate a several meter rise of sea levels. So the challenges of cities are enormous. The political power of cities is a different matter, however. We are organized primarily by nation states. Cities are often mere administrative units within nations. Politics are often anti-urban, actually, or the weight of politics is often disproportionately weighted towards rural areas, or the United States, so-called suburban areas. Tax systems are largely geared towards national level rather than the city level. And so the mechanisms for cities to organize themselves, make the necessary public investments, and take the measures that are needed for climate action as well as for other public goods is not proportionate with the scale of the challenge. So that is a fundamental problem, that we have big challenges, but we are not politically or fiscally organized to meet those big urban challenges. I like to think of these solution prospects in three dimensions. One is the technological transformation that cities will need for success. Second is the social pathways for socially inclusive, socially sustainable cities in the future. And the third is the financial pathway, the problem that I just indicated, which is that cities have huge problems, but they don't have huge budget revenues. And so something is going to have to be done to finance the adaptability of the cities. Let me speak briefly about each of these three dimensions. First, the technological pathway. Because of human-induced climate change getting worse, we know that worldwide we need a fundamental transformation of the world energy system. And cities are certainly no exception to that transformation. We know as well that we need a massive climate adaptation investment program as well, depending on the particular challenges that each city faces. If Cairo faces a water scarcity crisis, New York faces a water flooding crisis, for example. So each city is going to have to design its own resilience and adaptability programs according to its local context. But for that energy transformation, there is one basic answer, and that is to shift our power generation, that is electricity generation and distribution, to zero carbon energy sources. We need to shift out of the fossil fuel world of coal, oil, and gas of the past 2 centuries to a new energy system that, at least for the next 30 years, is fundamentally built on zero carbon renewable energy, such as wind, solar, ocean, hydropower, and in some places, nuclear energy as well. This transformation is not easy. First of all, it's expensive. It's capital intensive. It requires major investments. Second, it requires a lot of cooperation with neighboring countries, comprehensive energy overhaul. But let me just say, for cities, every city needs to have a green energy solution. Now, for Egypt, I would say one
piece of very good news is you have a lot of solar power that you can harvest and a lot of desert area that can be turned into some of the world's largest solar fields. So the massive production of solar panels in Egypt, manufactured and deployed in Egypt, obvious part of the future of smart cities of Egypt, a huge part of smart cities, a massive, massive deployment of solar energy. That's going to be used for all sorts of things, but cities will be electric. Our transport will be electric. We will move from vehicles predominantly to forms of public transport like rail or buses or self-driving, modular, and so forth, ready for zero carbon power transport. And so that will be the downstream end of the petroleum age. Egypt and Cairo will have a lot of air conditioning. Heat pumps, of course, electric air conditioning, and that will also require massive amounts of energy. And no doubt Egypt is going to have to deploy a tremendous desalination in the future. Desalination is not complex from an engineering point of view, but it is extraordinarily energy intensive, and it will have to rely on the mass of clean electricity. So I would say that point of view of city transformation, the first step is all electric, where cities entirely will be done with building, not with furnaces, electricity, and so forth. Electricity. As well, advances that can also impact on the urban heat. And this is one of the transformations ahead that will be extremely important. Changing the reflectance of the materials, the heat absorptive capacities of the materials, changing the albedo of the cities themselves will be part of urban resilience. Let me quickly turn to the other two transformations, the social pathways and the financial pathways. The social pathways require us to find 21st century inclusion. I believe that this will require large public budgets. I believe that social inclusion requires public health, not private health, public education, not private education primarily, public transport, not private transport, public or social housing to an important extent, not private housing. So the responsibility of government for social inclusion is enormous. Of all of the public investments that I would stress, incidentally, it would be education above all others, because the future will depend on well-educated populations. This will be by far the base for all future service economy, for future jobs, for future ability to solve social problems, for the future social peace, to be able to manage our societies that are trapped in ignorance, trapped without education will be not only impoverished, but also destabilized. All of that leads me to the third point. The biggest challenge of all is not what the technological transformation should look like, or even how to use the instruments of governance for social inclusion, but how to pay for it all. This is a huge challenge. Fundamentally, knowledge throughout the world. We're in Shams University from all over the world to enjoy the wonders of Egypt, global tourism, and many other sectors, all of which require knowledge, skills. So, to my mind, is the most important of all the public investments. But now to pay for all of this will require strategies for fiscal federalism, where governments at the national level or even at the regional level collect taxes and then distribute them to lower levels of government. They will also require parastatal or state enterprises that, on behalf of the public goods, make these investments, but then collect the public tariffs from the public to help pay the costs of the debt, but with a social inclusion dimension as well. We don't have global financial institutions yet that are really well attuned to the urban challenges. If you the Islamic development, by and large, these cities network that I lead on sub-finance, essentially how cities can pay their way in the 21st century, and how international institutions can also engage directly with cities for sustainable development-based financing. I would love to have Ain Shams involved in that effort. It will be a worldwide effort. I'd love to have the city of Cairo be part of this effort. We will have chairs by many mayors around the world, because every mayor I know is worried about this challenge of long-term financing of sustainable cities. And if we could have Cairo as one of the world's greatest cities, one of the world's oldest and most esteemed cities of humanity, part of this effort, this would tremendously deepen and enrich the process. Let me close here by thanking again the Ministry of Higher Education. We need you. We need excellence of Egypt's universities. Please count on me in any way that I can help at all. And for Ain Shams University for sponsoring Smart Cities 2023 and taking the intellectual lead. I'm profoundly honored to be part of this year's conference. Thank you so much.
Actually, you to Ain Shams, the president sitting here. I'm not sure whether you would like to respond to that shortly.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, for the insightful, actually, talk mentioned by the chair, and I would say eye-opening and really the passion you always speak to us about the global problems is really exemplary, and we're very delighted to have you. Thank you for the invitation, for Cairo as a city and then Shams University, and we'll convey this to our higher authorities. And please be sure that Shams University will be more than happy to participate with you in all your initiatives, especially the one you mentioned about the United Nations initiative. You touched on very important points and very smartly and in a stunning way, actually, as usual, about smart cities and the financial pillar, which of course is the biggest problem, and how we can solve this, at least the roadmap for us to go through. And I like very much the social, and I would echo what you said about the social pillar and education as a priority, and we always say education at all levels, because without this we cannot have our youngest and the coming generation as we expect from them. So thank you again, and we are really honored to have you with us, and thank you for accepting the invitation. And I remind you that I'm a surgeon like your wife, so I'm not an engineer as you are a big promoter for the engineers. But I'm happy, I was very happy to know that your wife is a doctor. And looking forward to receive you here in person and to be honored by presence. And in June, I'll make sure to get with you, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and hoping to see you again. Greetings to Varanasi. Bye-bye. So I will hand over to Dr. Gara, and you will take over to introduce our next distinguished guest. Thank you very much.
I want just to thank Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, and I borrow his word that in the era of transformation, actually the role of education become more and more important. And now for our second expert and speaker, it is one of the most important experts in the field of sustainable smart city and sustainable development. He has more than 150 papers published worldwide, and he supervised more than 50 PhD. I want to invite Professor Hassan Abdallah, the Provost and Academic Lead of the University of East London, which is our strategic partner at Ain Shams University. Thank you, and honored to share your experience.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. It's a great privilege and honor to be with you this afternoon. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the great organization of this very, very important conference. I'd like to thank His Excellency Dr. Ayman Ashur, the honorary chairman of the conference, Professor Mahmoud El-Mitani, president of the great Ain Shams University, and my very dear friend and brother, Dr. Omar Al-Husseini, for his great invitation. Thank you so much. And my great fellow professors of Ain Shams University, I think Ain Shams University are making transformative impact across Egypt, and also the impressive competitions you've been winning globally. It's a bit difficult, obviously, to follow great speakers who also cover lots of great strategic initiatives and ideas. And what I would like to focus, I would like to readjust my talk a little bit, so I can focus a little bit on the technical side of what the solutions. We hear great talk about the challenges and the negative impact and consequences these challenges have on us individually, locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. But what are the solutions? How can we deal with these solutions? I'd like also to put my own slide, different definition of what cities should focus on. We've been hearing great things about the smartness level of cities, and cities being somehow dominated by digitalization. And a number of this will cause as well exclusion of certain segments of the society. How many of the population across the globe are fully acquainted with the digital competencies in order to be able to deal with all these sort of emerging disruptive technologies, which are obviously transforming our business, transforming our daily lives, and the way we obviously deal with ourselves on a daily basis. So you will see in my title, I emphasize on resilience, responsibility of the smart cities. Cities will have to be smart, but resilience and responsible city, from my humble practical point of view, are even more important for the various reasons we will see in a few minutes with some sort of examples, which because of the limited time I have, I will just try, because of the talents we have here, I would like to give you that headlines and these examples in order to take these ideas further in some of your major projects and districts. And why are we talking about cities in particular? Because cities in particular is the powerhouse of the economy. If the city operates in a productive, scalable, reliable, efficient, inclusive, environmentally friendly way, the whole economy and the whole life would work smoothly. And that's why it's a truly multidisciplinary approach we have to take for that. And I dedicated lots of my time over the last few years before the importance of that, and started editing not just my own ideas, but working with large organizations, working with scholars from across the globe in order to be able with Springer to publish some of the work solutions which talented individual researchers have been working on in these sort of books, which addressing areas to do not just with climate change, not only with urban planning, urban designing, but also the social, the economical, the technological disruption which has actually transformed, as we transform cities, is also transformed our whole life and how we are responding to that. So if I look at very briefly, I would like to just look at the history examples, Cairo and London, for instance, how it's been evolving. I would like to look at the challenges facing cities nowadays and in the future, the present and the future. Why resilient and responsible city is a mission critical, if I may use this terminology, because 66% of the global population live in cities, and that's why it's important. Smart city, what is it? Smart city in Cairo or in Egypt would be far different from the smart city in India, who's trying to develop 100 cities in partnership with blue chip companies such as Siemens and others. What is it, and how would we tailor the smart cities in order to be fit for practice? That's highly important in terms of the understanding of that. And then a number of case studies we will go through very, very briefly because of the time in this case. So have a look here at Cairo, for instance. This is just a snapshot of what's happening. If you look at the picture over here, you will find that basically that's where 1930s, 40s, and then if you look at over here, you will find a totally different image from what we have about 60 years ago. So things have transformed quite substantially. Cairo is a massive, great culture and important city, one of the greatest globally. But how did we really take into consideration 60, 70 years ago, that sort of image right over there? There wasn't basically that sort of inner ring road, outer ring road, which will allow you that sort of flexibility to move from the center outside and from outside into the city in that sort of level of degree of agility, which we need nowadays. So it's very important that we take that into consideration. The other thing I would like to say is because of the importance of culture conservation, it's very important that we also pay attention to Cairo itself as a culture city, and obviously we have the new, basically modern, developed, well-designed city. But how do we connect to that? And how do we connect the new city with the rest of the country in this case? Here is another example. It's not just Cairo which has some challenges. Here is London as well. So in London, for instance, you look about 60 years ago, you will see the image on your left, and then now you see the image on your right. So in that image on your right, you can see the level of complexity. There are things scattered everywhere. But how do we connect to that? Physically, digitally, from a human factor point of view, is very, very important. And I will share with you some of the interventions we introduced and what sort of return on investment. Because when you invest something, you have to calibrate first. What is the return on investment for that? From a social, environmental, economical point of view. It's very important we consider that. Again, so why is this sort of challenges we're facing? It's the urbanization, is the growth of population, and that's obviously something very important. However, human being is the main asset. The main asset, obviously, to utilize in a very productive way in order to bring more prosperity to the economy. But that requires what? Requires competences, requires skills, requires leveling up. The leveling up is to actually for each local or region, how would you be able to develop the skill set required in order to enhance productivity? And that has to be a more tailored approach. So that sort of growth in terms of population globally is quite obviously incredible, 1.1% per year. That's equivalent to 80 plus million per annum. So it's obviously quite frightening, but at the same time require us to have the necessary mechanics, necessary systems and enablers in order to continue and cope with these challenges. And technology is starting to struggle. No, here we go. Right, we're talking about the challenges. Again, another example, just to share with you, you're all aware of the changes happening, the geological changes in the ocean, which lead to tsunami. And what do we do about this? Do we have flood defense designed, fit for practice, in order to protect those areas which are under, obviously, pressure and major hazards and events? We have seen, obviously, recent earthquake happening in Turkey and Syria. What are we doing about this from a building design point of view, from a city design point of view? Very important to look at earthquake resistance, design, foundation. Did we take that into consideration? What the sort of soil you have in this case when you deal with that? All these are very important issues we need to take into consideration. We can see obviously, again, what's happening in terms of climate and in terms of volcanoes, and how this will have a massive impact on the future generation and our business in general. Now, the other key thing here, as we all know, is basically behavior of individuals is very important. How we educate people in order to manage efficiently natural resources. Natural resources is a wealth we have. How we be able to manage that quite efficiently is very important. If we don't do that, we will have obviously a major challenges, and that will continue. And you already can see, for instance, what we are facing now. We started countries because of challenges with energy. We started moving into more traditional resources because of pressure on that. And this is just a summary of the challenges I mentioned earlier, but what I just would like to focus on here, just a couple of examples. Traffic in Cairo or in Egypt costs the country around 4% of its GDP. So you can imagine, translate that into billions. That's only traffic. And how we'll be able to manage that and control that. And if we look at London, for instance, traffic, residents of London and visitors spend an average of 75 hours per annum in traffic jams. That should translate that into 2 billion sterling pounds per annum. So that's incredible in terms of impact this has on the economy. So what do we do in order to address that? It's very important we take that into consideration. So because of all these sort of major challenges we're facing, can we move the slides, please? It doesn't move from here. Thank you. And that's why the way we look at cities from a resilience, from a smartness point of view, I define it as a complex ecosystem. That complex ecosystem have subsystems. What do you mean by these subsystems? Transportation, we keep saying about mobility, green transportation is a subsystem. Education is a subsystem. Health and how smart health should be is another subsystem. Energy, the smart grid is a subsystem. But how do we coordinate the interoperability amongst all these sorts of subsystems in order to serve the inhabitants of the city and serve a business is quite critical in this case. How do we do that? So in that case, we will start looking at not just urban planning and urban design, but also how the disruptive technology such Internet of Things will enable us to deal with that. So here, for instance, it's that nest to that right-hand side, where you will be able to see basically that sort of coordination. And I will share with you an example we are working on in the UK at the moment to address some of these challenges. Just before I move on to London and some of the interventions, I just would like to give you that example, because you see that example without being critical of the design at all. I just would like to share with you. Does anybody know what is this? Great design, looks amazing, looks impressive, very luxury. However, it has major problems. This is the Jumeirah city or circle in Dubai. So the issue with that is that's this great design. There is a major problem with the traffic. There is massive traffic congestions, which led to people that started preferring to work from home instead of going to work. Why is that? Because the design of that is not fully connected with the main flow of the highways. How would you look at the capacity within the circle itself and outside. And at the same time, monitor the traffic at certain times, monitor the capacity at the surrounding area, and where the destination of the various residents in that area would lead to. So that's the sort of thing that we may think from an architecture design point of view, very impressive. However, the reality in terms of the user experience is a major challenge here. So I'd like to give very briefly some examples here, which is about. Thank you. Let's take example London. London was designed in a way which basically cope with urbanization and growth in population, which is quite rapid. But the issue here is not just about the residents or inhabitants within the city of London. The issue here is about we have over 31 million journeys every day in just one city. We have about 30 million visitors per annum, and that number is going up exponentially. How do we deal with that? So that's causing obviously major issues. And at the same time, London is the powerhouse of the economy of the UK. So the connection with the cities outside London is quite essential here in order to facilitate that sort of flow and efficient mobile transportation. Again, this is the image you have seen earlier, just satellite image to show you how scary the city in terms of urbanization started to look like. So we started taking a step back and said, look, we need a more holistic approach. As we have heard previously from previous speakers, Dr. Mahmoud, Mohideen, and also Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and so on, you need to take a more holistic approach to that. So what we started reflecting on in our plan for the next 5 to 7 years is to commit about 411 billion pounds. Some of it already being spent about 3-4 years ago, but there are obviously a number of major other projects we're still currently working on in order to address the problem, not just locally in London, but also with the surrounding city in a very connected way. So we realize that we need to invest in transport about 127 billion. Some of these projects, like Crossrail, which I will show you very briefly, that one is already being completed and is running, and the impact of that positive impact is very impressive. Energy, 245 billion. That's in terms of not just renewable in terms of the wind energy and solar energy, but also we use things like heat pumps, power heat pumps for colleagues in other specialities in engineering who would be able to also use the water as a major source of energy in this case. Water and sewage as well, 25 billion. But waste management is a major issue. And how would we generate energy out of waste? Okay, so it's moved, if its slide is moving fast. Okay, but science and research is very important because there are challenges. We don't have solutions. As we go along, we still come across some major challenges. How are we going to address that? And also on the coast, there are also floods. So we have to focus on designing flood defense in order to protect cities from flood. So what we started first to have a full insight. Let's imagine, for instance, the admin capital here in Egypt, where we are in at the moment. Let's start on how would we have a full insight of what is happening across the capital. And that's what started with the digital map. And you all know about building information management systems. So where we have to connect basically the various key points across the city with a central AI system, which will enable us to capture real big data from various key points in order to give us insight of what is happening in the city in this case. And we'll be able to divert, for instance, traffic and any major incidents and events into the right place in this case. So it helps us in terms of the traffic flow control. It gives us full insight on pressure points at certain times of the day, of the week, of the month. Based on that, was basically the AI in order to help us to inform us from decision-making point of view. It's also connected to the smart grid, where you will be able as well to predict. So you will have, hopefully, with avoid to have any blackout time, where obviously there is cut in terms of power and so on. This is one of the projects. I touched on that project very briefly last time, which is called Crossrail. Crossrail is 117 kilometers going underneath the high-rise buildings in London, 31 kilometers under the financial city, and that was a major challenge, as you would appreciate. Because what we wanted to connect East London to West London. Time usually used to take about 127 minutes, but we wanted to cut that time to half. So how can we do that? Obviously, the city wasn't designed to take into consideration tunneling and how would you dig under obviously neat high-rise buildings, and there are lots of challenges with the archaeology, which we will have to work on and so on. Anyway, we managed to complete that project, which is 18.8 billion pounds, and I'm glad to say it has been a pleasant experience, and it actually cut the time in this case to more than half the time being cut as a result of that sort of major project, and it's called now Elizabeth Line. There were a group of great professors visited us in London a few weeks back. I'm not sure whether they tried that sort of line or not, but it's a great successful project as a way of addressing that problem. And then, as I said, London alone cannot function separately. We have to connect it with the other cities, and that's why the current major project we're working on is called High Speed 2, where we connect London with Birmingham and Manchester, because we noticed that the trade traffics coming from those cities are growing and will have a massive impact on the economy. So in this case, we're starting this project. We aim to finish the first phase in about 7 years, and then another phase which will take much longer. But the key thing about this is electric, this is zero carbon, so you will have no impact in terms of carbon footprint in this case. And then we started talking about more blue sky ideas. People wanted to go from one place to another, one city to another, in a short span of time. And at the same time, the air pollutions obviously have to be minimized, or we have to achieve zero carbon. So we started working on, as a consortium, on what we call the air flying taxis, which will connect, in this case, central London by the outskirts of London and other cities in this case. So this is something quite, I think, exciting, and I think we can apply some of these ideas here in the admin capital in Egypt to connect the capital with the rest of the country, and that will obviously give us more mobilization. But we're facing some major challenges. These challenges, can anybody guess? It's not technically challenges because the design and production of these sort of taxis are already being tested and delivered, but we're facing a couple of issues. Does anybody know? Can you guess what these issues are? Security is one, great. What else? Yes, who said that? Hey, well done, you have 5 pounds. Can somebody give him 5 pounds, please? Well done, excellent. So acceptance and airfield regulations is a challenge, which would obviously take much time for us to convince. And this is just a model we managed to do using Metaverse in order to model the city and imagine how these flying taxi, air flying taxi will be controlled, what sort of routes we will have, and so on. Because of time, I wanted to move fairly quickly to the next project, which is 2 plus. How do we convert? We started by ourselves. Say, how can we make our region, our campuses? We have 3 campuses in our university as a strategic partner, proud to say, of Ancient University, in order to achieve zero carbon in everything we do. But we wanted to do this not by basically having a smart grid and connect that and then achieve the zero carbon. No. We would like to make sure that our campuses, our university, is a living lab for the 70 billion steering towns development, urban development taking place around East London. In terms also to give the students and energy leaders the opportunity to experiment what we're doing. So we wanted something to be scalable, we would like it to be automated, we would like it to be sustainable from a social, economical, and environmental point of view, secure, more personalized, more efficient, and so on. So what we started doing here is that we partnered with the blue chip Siemens as a way of being able, obviously, to provide us with the necessary technology. And then we started talking to our key stakeholders. Stakeholders in this case are the business people around, the developers, the local authority, the students, the researchers, the government, all these sorts of key players. We started working with them in order to identify what sort of model we should have. I've been given now the notice to finish, so I will try to run through this fairly quickly. This is an example of basically what we have in terms of the smart grid and how we transform our campus to be able to do that. And again, these sort of examples could be applied, for instance, to the admin capital here and so on. This is again more technical detail for those who are technically interested in that, which we could discuss from stage. This is again how the information you captured in real time feed back into the basically into the grid and onto the total management systems, back to the living lab in order to optimize and pinpoint area of high basically energy usage. That's basically an example of what the user interface would look like. In that case, again, an example of how the community will interface with that living lab in order to understand how will you optimize, how will you manage, how will you use carbon footprint, how will you be able to apply this actually to your own house, to your own company, to your own commercial buildings, and so on. Very important to explore all that as a research and development institution in this case. There's no time for that video, but again, there's another problem here we have with London City Airport. that London City Airport, London City is shifting east. So London shifting east, not the central anymore, and the growth in terms of the commercial activities taking place there is quite enormous, and that's why we have to start expanding our London City Airport here. But the constraints we have is as you can see, is that it's surrounded by water, as you can see. So we have to, in this case, work on what you call it floating runway, and that will have obviously major issues. The other thing, as you can see, you see the tall buildings where the financial city is, and obviously based on the wind direction of the takeoff, the aircraft will have to be controlled by that. So the distance, obviously, between these high-rise buildings and the flight before it's fully airborne is become a challenge for us, and how will we be able to manage that? How are we able at the same time to make the airport smarter? That's quite important as well. So the passengers, before they depart from their home or wherever, you will be able to have a roadmap of what they expect to see. Right, I think smart health is another area, and the King of the United Kingdom came and visited our university a few days ago to open our training hub, which basically shows how we are able, because one of the problems, for instance, during the pandemic is that you obviously brought the whole globe into halt. So we started thinking of augmented reality, virtual reality, in order to be able to do remote diagnosis, help physicians and so on, in that without spreading the obviously infection of the disease. You'll be able to do full training. So this is a case, for instance, somebody have a cardiac issues. How will you be able to take the various parts, do experiments without obviously any human risk in that case? So how would you think this way? Smart health, we call it. So this is also the projects we are working on. The other projects here is basically about how we use metaverse to do that sort of full simulation of a gallery or a city before investing anything. Let us move on, please, because of time. Let us skip this, let us skip that. I just wanted to spend half a minute. Do I have half a minute? Or that's it? Okay.
You pass the time.
Sorry? Okay, half a minute. Okay, so that's, I would like to give this example about our great new capital city, because from my personal view, it should be the knowledge economy capital of the country, maybe the region, maybe Africa, because it's a great design, but obviously we would like to connect all the key elements. The examples I mentioned in London about how we were able to have data mining of basically what's happening, about the smart highways, about how would we connect the city with the rest, with the other cities, how would we also maintain the connections with basically everywhere there is business growth, and obviously the energy management and the waste management. So that city could be an example actually for the rest of the cities in the region, which would be used to follow. Okay, so I will skip the rest of detail about how can we do that and how do we connect the city with the rest of the cities. And that's an example of the flood defense we are doing with Japan because of tsunami and the change in obviously the geological ocean change which causes that. Right. So I would like to thank you for listening and apologies for taking time for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Abdallah, for the interesting presentation. And I just want to ensure that, as you say, that human well-being is the most important target for any smart and resilient city. And thank you for for exchanging all your experience. And I want just, if anyone on the floor has a question for Professor Abdullah. Yes, please.
Learning from the pandemic time and learning from the lesson of widening the roads to create traffic, we are putting a seed in the presentation. That you are putting all smart technologies, state-of-the-art technology in servicing, facilitating mobility, facilitating commuting, and transportation. Can we use the smart technology in not doing that? That's my question.
Sorry, can you say again?
In not facilitating mobility, transportation, and commuting.
Absolutely. I think this is the real question. This is the real challenge because, as you would appreciate, for developing countries, the challenge is how will you be able to extend their infrastructure in order to be able to cope with that sort of disruptive, basically, changes happening from technological point of view, from basically the pattern of work, which changes quite rapidly, and so on. But for developed countries, it's basically how will you be able to upgrade and ensure the existing infrastructure is basically more relevant to be able to cope with basically urbanization and rapid growth in population. And I think the examples I gave for London, for instance, and how we are committed, because we are not going to redesign London. London, as colleagues mentioned earlier, you will see things quite great outside, but inside basically cities or buildings, there are conservation. Conservation is a very important because of the culture, the identity of obviously hundreds of years. So definitely these examples we could apply to the current Cairo capital as a culture city and how we'll be able to strengthen its basically infrastructure to be able to cope with that. But the key thing I would like us to be careful with is the social inclusion. We have to ensure that the population is fully on board with us in terms of their digital literacy, how will they be able to deal with the artificial intelligence, all the Internet of Things, or the real data, how will they be able to navigate that? Because if they are not competent to deal with that, that would obviously cause a reverse results in business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hassan Abdullah. Thank you.
Okay, it's been a pleasure to participate in the moderation of this session by introducing Professor Eric. Actually, the introduction is quite difficult for Professor Eric because he has a very wide spectrum from psychology to data centers, data informatics, data science, and so on. He is in the school, professor in the School of Innovations, and he is the head of the Center for Smart Cities and Regions in Arizona State University, with which we have a strong collaboration also in HH University. So, Professor Eric, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It is an honor to be invited to speak to you today. I'm very grateful for the amazing collection of people that are here for the talk. And I'm particularly grateful for all the students that are here. One fun fact for you guys is over the last decade on Rate My Professor at Arizona State University, I have been the #1 faculty out of over 10,000. So, good luck. What I have heard repeatedly today is sort of the need for interdisciplinarity. And so one other interesting fact is I have 7 degrees in 7 different areas. I started out in mathematics, computer science, and psychology, where I did my undergraduate thesis using computational neural network models to understand how infants understand their world. Then I got my master's degrees in business and information technology, where I went to work for a computer security company, again, using neural network models to understand dynamic computer security and real-time adjustments. I liked it so much, I went back to get my PhD at the University of Michigan in information and complex systems. When I joined Arizona State University 16 years ago, I got appointed to none of these programs. Instead, I was appointed to the School of Public Administration, where I got tenure and was asked to create a Center for Policy Informatics, a Center for Smart Cities and Regions, and to help build the decision theory. Since then, I've also helped create 2 first-of-its-kind schools at the Arizona State University, the School for the Future of Innovation and Society and the School for Complex Adaptive Systems. And so, when I look at some very basic questions, like why, what, who, and how, you'll see that my answers are slightly different than a lot of the answers that you're going to see here, and I hope that they complement them. Overall, when I think about this, as we kick off a conference focused on smart cities, what I want to do is I want to focus our attention today on how a community can internalize the concept of smartness as a set of principles and behaviors for promoting discovery, deliberation, and understanding. Things or processes that I think require curiosity, humility, and empathy. Because over the course of the dozen examples that I'm going to give you, we keep finding that it's not the data, it's not the technology that prevents things, it is a lack of these 3 things. A lack of curiosity, a lack of humility, or a lack of empathy that prevents us from actually achieving things. So, my articulation of smart cities is a smart city cultivates new attention resources and spends that attention wisely. And it can do this in one of 2 ways. The first way it can do this is by paying less attention to the things we should ignore, or paying more attention to things that need our attention to be focused on. Or another way of saying that is how do we take things that are currently visible and make them invisible? And for me, this is where we see a lot of sort of advancements in current smart cities approaches. So let's start with something simple and then work to more complex. Simple, paying your bills. A decade ago, I would set aside an entire afternoon to go through all my bills for me. Today, I don't even know where my checkbook is because everything has been automated. It's not something I think about on a regular basis. Or the idea of traffic. Back in the day, you have to plan out your trip, you have to figure out how to get somewhere. Today, you get into a car and it dynamically tells you the best route. And if an accident happens along the way, it will wrap you around it without you having to understand what is happening. Or the idea of supply chains. If you want to buy something like this amazing book, you recognize that now there are many different options in terms of I can order it and get it delivered in 2 days, I can get it delivered in 2 hours. Soon we'll be able to get it delivered via drone. Or I can click on it and it will automatically show up on my Kindle device. And like most infrastructures, when it works well, it becomes invisible. You don't have to pay attention on it. But when it breaks down, everyone sees it. Off, and now we turn back on. Notice that when the infrastructure changed, everyone paid attention. Now let's look at some more complicated sort of situations. For instance, what do other parts of the system know and how do I discover that? You're very familiar with the idea of search engines or Google, or just being able to go to Google and type in something without knowing where it actually exists on the internet. But as you tackle sort of sophisticated problems like resilience, homelessness, future of education, or social justice, how do you know what your contribution does with larger parts of the system? One of the places that I work is at the Decision Theater, which brings together different groups that are working on similar projects. And we have them share their data with us so that we can integrate that together so everyone's contribution makes sense within the larger system that they're trying to help. We call this the convergence workshops. Or my favorite example of this is imagine that you have type 1 diabetes. And that the amount of time or energy you have to take in terms of monitoring your personal health or your family's health. We worked with a collection of people that decided they weren't going to wait around for the healthcare industry to create a a better way for them to manage their diabetes, and so they created their own artificial pancreas by connecting a Raspberry Pi device, an artificial or a continuous glucose monitor, and an insulin pump. And then they shared their device with other people. And so they now have an artificial pancreas that works better than most of us have a pancreas that works. Now, what's interesting about this is a couple things. The first is working with this patient community. It was the first time the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation ever funded a patient community to lead the research and to lead the grants. They had always funded scientists before to make the discoveries. But the second aspect of this is because they came up with such an amazing device, because they scaled it to hundreds and thousands of families, all sorts of researchers wanted to work with them. So many wanted to work with them that they felt that they were being preyed upon by these researchers. And so we helped them build something that was called a humility audit. For them to give to faculty to say, if you want to work with us, are you coming from a place of service? Are you coming from a place of community? Or are you actually just advancing your own interest in your own work? And so this notion of humility was absolutely essential for sort of the collaboration that was necessary. So that's one category. The second part, and before I jump into the next category, what within your own life do you pay too much attention to that you wish you never had to think about again? How much sleep you need, how much food you need, how much caffeine you need, how much alcohol you need, how much pain you have. All of these things can now be managed in such a way with smart technologies that you don't have to pay as much attention. Research taking place. You can grow to more complex. Is significantly different. And is it beneficial? Inside of this is there was a faculty member from Virginia Tech Institute, Virginia Tech, that came to them with a bunch of water testing kits and said, please test your own water and let us know whether or not it's healthy. And when families tested their water and found it was unhealthy, then they started recognizing this is a problem that I'm facing on a regular basis. How do we advocate for it? But as I watched this, I recognized myself, I don't know the quality of my own water. And so as you zoom out, you realize that Flint, who you see up here in the top, was not the only ones that were struggling from low-quality water. You also saw that Detroit was doing this. But I'm not from Detroit. I'm from a different part of the United States in Arizona. So as you zoom out, you recognize that this is a pervasive problem that people outside of Flint were not talking about. Fortunately and unfortunately, I'm from Maricopa, Arizona, that also has similar challenges associated with their water. But a lot of times we weren't paying attention to this type of challenge. Or what about air? What is the quality of air outside here, outside our own communities? One of the projects that we had was a community was built right next to an active mine that they promised was going to shut down before people moved into the neighborhood. But then people started getting sick because they didn't shut the mine down. And every single day you would hear these massive explosions that were taking place as they were mining, and the community was certain that that was what was causing them to be sick. So working with us, what we did is we set up 24-hour air quality sensors to determine whether or not the explosions correlated with the time for the quality of the air within the region. And in fact, what ended up being discovered was it wasn't the explosions, but it was the dirt road that heavy machines were going. I'm trying to use the mouse. This dirt road right here, where the heavy machines were going in, back and forth, were causing the air quality to get lower. And armed with this data, they went to the construction company and paved the road. And they saw a dramatic increase in the quality of air as well as their own health benefits. But it allowed for them to discover, to get evidence, and to advocate for themselves. What about the opioid crisis in the United States? This is something that we kind of understand now, but for over a decade was plaguing certain regions of the United States. This information was not available. In fact, if you dig into the conversations around the opioid crisis, what you'll find out is the first people to discover a crisis in fact existed were the people that worked at the funeral homes. because they had to put cause of death down for each of the bodies that they processed, and they kept noticing more and more they were putting opioid overdose as the cause of death. The problem was they had no one to tell about this. There was not a system in place to pay attention to this specific challenge, and when you look into this, you can start recognizing that in this one county in particular, that on average, every single person was prescribed 173 opioid pills every single year. But again, we didn't have a system to pay attention to this. Or what about even more complicated things? What happens if we made visible the quality of justice on a regional level, or the amount of vulnerabilities that existed between different neighborhoods? Or what about an even more difficult concept like the concept of empathy? If I can make visible the amount of empathy that existed within this room, or the amount of empathy that existed within your neighborhood, how would that change the way that you navigated your environment, or change the way that you collaborated with other people? In fact, this is exactly what we did. We came up with a technique to make empathy visible within different groups, and it changed how we recommended different organizations collaborate with each other. Now, we stumbled into our research on empathy because of a project that we had looking at the management of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is a large body of water that serves 7 different states on the eastern side of the United States. And we designed a simulation that allowed for 1,000 people to concurrently explore what was happening in terms of taking the role of a farmer, a fisherman, a real estate developer, a politician, etc., to simulate certain types of outcomes for the Chesapeake Bay. And to validate our model, we went to the farmers in the region and said, will you work with us and tell us whether or not we got it right? And the farmers shocked us by saying, no, we want nothing to do with it. And this caught us off guard, because we were trying to understand the situation better, and the farmers responded, every time that we interact with the government or with academics, they tell us we're doing something wrong. And so from our perspective, it's us versus everybody else. And it took months to build up a relationship of trust so that they would start working with us. And once we had that relationship developed with them, they started playing with our simulations. That the questions that you're asking about the fertilizer that we use or when we harvest are reasonable questions. We said, that's great. We tried playing the simulation now as a crab fisherman. They hated the crab fishermen. They were their mortal enemies. And so once they tried playing as the crab fishermen, they started recognizing the crab fishermen had nothing against farmers, but the pollution from the fertilizer was affecting the harvest that they were getting in terms of the crabs. And they saw this and they recognized 2 things. One, the health of the bay was beneficial for everyone. The second thing they saw was that there was an easy solution that would allow for them to shift when they harvest, based upon when the crab fishermen needed to harvest. And they came up with a common solution because they no longer saw the crab fishermen as enemies, but as a legitimate part of a system that they were also involved. Now, a quick note on this is that we tested out sort of empathy within a whole bunch of different environments, and although empathy is normally sort of framed as a weakness or a soft skill, over and over again, the more empathy a group had, the more resilient they were to external threats, the more resilient they were to identify people that were trying to take advantage of them, and the more creative they were to coming up with their own solutions to organize what was happening. The mouse has a mind of its own. Okay. Now, one of the projects that we've had over an ongoing basis that I'm going to return to a couple of times is the leaders of education within Arizona came to us and said, we need to achieve a higher level of education, like Jeffrey Sachs talked about. And by 2030, we want 60% of adults in Arizona to have a post-secondary education. Can you help us come up with a way to do this? And we said, yes, but we have 2 conditions. First, out of the $1 million you're willing to spend, we want to spend only half of it building the simulation. The other half of the money we want to spend building the relationships with the people that actually have to enact the policies that are going to come up, and the people that are going to be affected by the changes in education. The other change that we require from them is you have to come and work with us every 2 weeks for the next year. We're not going to do this and then show up a year from now and show you the beautiful model that we created and then watch you not use it. And so please work with us as we build it. And I'll explain as the talk goes along why this makes such a difference. The second question about who. We talk about smart cities by being measured by who we include in their process and how do they succeed. So I just mentioned a series of projects around air quality, around education, around heat vulnerability. How many of you could constructively add to those conversations? My guess is most of you have something to say. Most of you are innovative. Most of you have great ideas about this. Then when was the last time a mayor, a governor, or a president came to you and said, we need your talent, we need your expertise? That probably doesn't happen. And so the question of who participates is a very important one. What you see in terms of this map is the use of a civic technology in the United States called Boston 311, which is basically a non-emergency system to get your government to come help you with graffiti, with snow removal, with basic services. But you see a huge disparity in terms of who uses this public service. To oversimplify our research over the last 5 years, the more you look like the people that designed the system, the more likely you're going to use the system. And when we pointed out that there are these huge gaps, the logical answer from the developers were, oh, we just need to train people how to use 311. We need to train people how to use their phone. Obviously, a lack of knowledge about how to use the phone was not the reason they weren't using the system, but because they didn't have trust, it wasn't answering their questions, and they weren't participating in the design of the system themselves. Similarly, when we think about sort of the future of smart cities, when we talk about gender, how do we make sure that we include over half the population that's going to be affected by the conversations and by the implementations of the systems that you're going to hear about today? This is a spectacular book that looks about what are the consequences of when only one group of people designs a world that the rest of the people have to participate in, and the importance of thinking more broadly and thinking more inclusively. The other aspect that we've heard a lot about today is the importance of empowering local communities and local regions. Now, one of the sort of false dichotomies that a lot of our research tries to get at is the dichotomy between should we do a top-down centralized approach or should we do a bottom-up local approach. And what we keep finding over and over is both of them are uniquely effective, and we need to invest in the interconnectivity between the two. So for instance, the top-down approach would tell you that a new diet like intermittent fasting will help you save or help you lose about 8 pounds on average over the course of a month. Now, when you look into the data, though, you'll find that if you test 221 people, although on average you'll lose 8 pounds, here's the distribution of how much people lost. And so the bottom-up approach is, well, does it work for me? Can I orient myself in terms of those 221 people on this chart and figure out if intermittent fasting makes the most sense for me, or should I try the South Beach diet, or should I try the Mediterranean diet, or should I try something else? But how do I discover for myself what makes the most sense? And so how do we leverage both top-down and bottom-up solutions? Another question within this sort of space is a lot of times you can't wait for someone to come around to the problem that you care about. You need pathways in order to contribute. In Arizona, like in Egypt, it gets incredibly hot. And unfortunately in Arizona, people die when it's incredibly hot. We have hundreds of deaths a year that could be prevented. And it's also something that could be solved. We could have the public health agency engineer an environment where no one dies because of heat. But that's not currently their priority. Fortunately, we don't have to wait around for them to solve this problem or for it to become one of their priorities. Because if you look at all these blue dots, there's all sorts of organizations within Arizona that provide shelter, provide heating solutions, provide water for people so that they can get out of the heat when it becomes incredibly hot. But they're loosely organized and they don't know a lot about themselves. And so one of the projects that we had was to go out and map the environment. And so what you see here is an agent-based model where our grad students went out and met with every single one of them and said, where are you located? When are you open? What hours do you operate? And then once we mapped this, we made this come to life, and I'm not going to do that for you today, but you would see that sort of as it got hotter and hotter and hotter, you'd have more agencies open, but at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they'd all shut down. And as soon as you showed this to them, they looked at it and they said, well, I see 2 problems. One is at the hottest time of the day, all of us close at the same time. The other thing I noticed is that and so one of the most common questions we got from them was, can you give us the contact information of the people that are near us so that we can coordinate our hours of operation as well as the services that we provide so that we are able to self-organize what our services are to help as many people as possible as a collective organization. You see, this is a very different approach, where imagine their response to the public health agency came to them and said, you have to be open at this time, you have to move your location, you have to do something different, versus them discovering for themselves, this is what makes the most sense for us, let us coordinate our activities and our behaviors. Going back to the education model that I talked about, as we included more participations with the second half of that budget, we got better questions that came up. I am embarrassed to admit it took us about a month for someone to ask, when we're talking about achieving 60% of adults with a post-secondary education, does it matter which 60? Yes. Yes, it does. But it took over a month for us to sort of recognize that. You can think about it as maybe the 60 is the easiest 60 to educate. Maybe we want a spread or sort of equity sort of driven 60%, where 60% in every population. Or maybe we want the most efficient or the most useful or the most beneficial 60%, and we could target people specifically. And I'm even more embarrassed to admit that it took us 2 more months for anyone to ask the question, what about the other 40%? What do we do with them? Are we thinking about a bimodal distribution? Or are we thinking about a situation that we're designing an environment where that in 5 years we have 65%, in 5 more years we have 70%, and we have this gradual increase so that we can have more education? What about the relationship between attainment of education and resilience within your communities? Where will we get our nurses and teachers because we know that shortages are coming? What about how vulnerable are different regions or groups to automation? These are the types of questions that we did not think of ourselves, but by including diverse perspectives and ideas, we were able to include within the model and the conversations that we had moving forward. The challenge that I note at the bottom is to design inclusive governance infrastructures that allow us to both detect what's happening, to deliberate on what possible situations or possible solutions are available, and then discover what works and for whom. Now we get into how do we do this. Now, one of the questions that I have for every group that I come across is if you could double the amount of knowledge or curiosity in the world, what would you choose? I heard one person say curiosity. I can't ask each of you individually, but we've asked over 1,000 people, and I'd say over 85% of people say curiosity. The military says it's knowledge. That's just a side note. But we designed most of our systems assuming that the thing that we're lacking is, in fact, knowledge. But over and over, what we keep finding is that we're in a weird era right now where certainty of knowledge is rewarded more than accuracy of knowledge. And so if I'm confident, I'm more likely to be rewarded than if I'm accurate in terms of what I say. And so one of the big challenges that we come across in the decision theater is how do we get people with power to be curious? And the way that we've approached that is by creating an environment that allows for them to maintain their expertise, but also to explain to us how the system works. And as they think in new ways, in new dimensions, they start seeing things that they hadn't realized before. They think dimensionally different, which gets into the concept that we've come up with, which I'm going to talk about in a second. These 2 slides are sort of reversed, called focus stacking, but I'll get back to that. One of our big projects with the Department of Transportation was coming up with a way to think through planning for the next 30 years in terms of the budget. They came to us with a big frustration that their current process at best will continue the existing sales tax of 0.4%, and they're worried that people are not taking this process seriously. And we asked them, what do you mean by that? And so we attended the City Hall meeting with them, and for 3 hours, 3 of the 30 people in the Citizen Committee talked about whether or not there should be free Wi-Fi on buses. And it was a fascinating conversation, but they were frustrated because that's such a small component of this overall larger conversation. So we spent months working with the city of Phoenix, and we came up with this solution, where we took that group of 30, broke them into smaller groups of 5, brought in all the sort of leaders within transportation, and said, using these pieces of paper, show us the future that you want. And so if you wanted to save money in terms of taxes, you had to cut services. You had to see how those 2 were interrelated. And if you see, you have 24 hours in terms of service that you can provide at all times, but on the side you had daylight hours, and on the other side you had only during the weekend. And every time that you sort of did an option, you got a smaller square, so you were able to save money, and you could see the consequence of it. What ended up happening within this environment is all of the groups, including hardcore Republicans and Tea Party people who opposed taxes. They fought against taxes. They said, well, you know what? The future that I want will actually require an increase of taxes, but look at what we get for that. It tied those two things together. And in fact, they ended up advocating for the largest sales tax increase in the history of Arizona State, a difference of $13.5 billion over the initial sales tax. And my favorite note of this, is Wi-Fi on buses. And as soon as they saw that, everyone's like, yeah, of course we want that. It took less than 5 seconds to move on to the next part of the conversation, which is how often do we repave our streets, which is a huge factor. Now, going back to focus stacking, the way that we approach this is the concept of focus stacking. Now, in photography, if you look at one thing, if I were to take a picture of the front row, the students would be blurry. But if I were to take a picture of the students, the front row would be blurry. But if I want to get a sense of the entire picture with everybody in focus, then we use an approach that's called focus stacking, where you just take pictures of these different areas. We see a similar problem when we talk about systems. And so within systems, there are 4 dimensions of places where we tend to focus on one dimension while losing perspective of the other dimensions. The first is about scale. When you talk about a project, do you talk about it at the individual level? Do you talk about it at the family level? Do you talk about it at the regional level? Do you talk about it at the city level, the global level? All of those are legitimate, but we tend to have a bias in terms of what we can actually control. And so we focus on one level while losing perspective at the other levels. Second, what discipline are you from? You will hear repeatedly people talk about technological solutions to smart cities here. And that is absolutely reasonable and appropriate, but they're probably trained as engineers to think through that. Well, what other questions are they not asking in terms of legal questions, in terms of societal questions, in terms of cultural questions, in terms of architectural questions, or in terms of engineering questions? All of those are legitimate. I'm not advocating for one or the other. What I'm advocating for is a system that sees how they interact with each other and can take the best of each of those characteristics from to complement each other. The other aspect is you probably interact with one part of the system but are unaware of the other parts, like the crab fishermen and the farmers. They dealt with one part of the Chesapeake Bay, but we're not aware of the real estate development, or we're not aware of the wildlife that they were affecting. So how do you allow for them to get the perspective of my influence within this place has consequences across the entire system? So how do I understand that? Or, this one's tough to explain. What's that court used for? All sorts of things. You can see, just by looking at it, that there's many different uses of these systems. Just like as you go to a city, as you go to a region, as you go to a neighborhood, there's many different uses for those systems, none of which are better or worse than the other, but all of them are being used. So how do you make the different uses of the system that you're participating in visible so you can understand the effect of your contribution or your efforts? Now, going back to this education model, one of the key things that led to actual change in education policy was that we worked with the people that actually had to develop education policy. And so we were very thoughtful about how do you communicate the findings both to themselves and to the people that would implement it, emphasizing empathy. We also recognized that we would not bring every single person, every single teacher, every single principal to the decision theater to show them the model that we created. And so we came up with a roadshow that we could take to them and say, help us understand what's happening in the regional parts of this area. Help us understand what's happening in your environment. Focusing on sort of the humility of this. We were in service of the principles that needed to implement the policies that were being sort of passed down. Or the final aspect was how you develop an ethos so that it's not just this one time that we're going to come up with innovations about what works in education, but that everyone's invited to participate and everyone has a pathway to participate. So how do you create an environment of curiosity so that people think, if I come up with a better idea for what will work for my school, I can test it out, and if it works, I can share my idea with others so they can test it out in their own environment. Emphasizing curiosity. Over and over, we keep getting back to this sort of conclusion. You're far more likely to act on information if you were the one that discovered it themselves than if we came to you and told you what the information is and how you should behave. So when we talk about smart as an ethos, this is what I think about when I think about smart cities. You'll notice on the left, these are questions that I did not ask as we did our research. First, how should farmers fertilize their crops? Or where should wind and where should cooling stations be open? How to create an artificial pancreas? How much money should Phoenix spend on transportation, or which 60%? We have experts that can answer these questions. I didn't ask those questions. But what I did ask was, well, how would you design these inclusive decision or governance infrastructures that supported detection, deliberation, and discovery? Can we actually engineer societal transitions like the transportation piece? What is the role of empathy within collaboration, and why is it the sort of missing ingredient in a lot of distributed organizations? How do you grow these types of
about actually the empathy as a non-measurable. That you can measure so they can be read. How can you quantify? Thank you.
government agencies to be took that and created sort of next stage sort of the amount of empathy within it. Actually increase empathy of technology within that. Walk them out in someone else's name as them, but when they did it, they trivialized the experience. They thought of themselves strategically trying to win instead of actually empathizing with what was happening. But I can share with you a dozen papers on how we did that.
I'm sure we'll talk after.
Okay.
During lunch.
I look forward to it.
Okay, we'd like to thank you all. I think there's a lot of questions from Professor Eric, but we can continue the question with the lunch. So let's thank again Professor Eric for this very good question.
Thank you.
And by this we end the session. We would like to.
In lieu of the Smart Cities Conference, we decided to act smart as well. So a parallel conference was created where you can have access to it from anywhere in the world, either through downloading a desktop application where you can create an avatar and attend the conference online via a replica, similar to the metaverse idea, as well as a mobile application where you can download it from the website and attend the live sessions. In addition to all of that, there are a couple of immersive activations, such as VR and Connect, available in front of the exhibition. شكرا لكل المتحدثين. أود أن أرحب بدكتور